Hello. In the previous lecture, I considered the factors that provided the historical context for the period leading up to the Protestant Reformation. I outlined the various forces that seemed to be militating against the idea of a universal church and the continued existence of Christendom. But none of those forces foredoomed the events that rendered the church founded by Christ asunder during the 16th century. The Protestant Reformation may have occurred without Martin Luther, but it would not have taken place in the way it did without his very active participation. Without any doubt whatsoever, Martin Luther played the central role in the revolt against papal authority that we now refer to as the Protestant Reformation. His life epitomizes the great man theory of historical causation, a thesis that claims that history is driven by remarkable individuals, an idea popularized by the British author Thomas Carlyle during the 19th century, who claimed that the history of the world is but the biography of great men. Given Luther's enormous impact on history, it may surprise some that his origins were so humble. Luther was born on the 10th of November 1483 in Eisleben, Saxony, now a part of Germany, but then a rather remote part of a principality within the Holy Roman Empire. His father, Hans, was the son of a peasant, but his mother, Margaretha, came from a fairly prosperous family. Both parents were pious and very hard-working and were determined that Martin, their firstborn son, should be successful in life. Despite his lowly origins, Hans Luther burned with ambition. While Luther was still a baby, Hans moved the family to the nearby town of Mansfeld, where he found work as a copper miner. Eventually, through sheer hard work and by using his native intelligence, Hans became a successful copper smelter and operator of mines. As a result, the Luthers became one of the most respectable families in all of Mansfeld. Socially ambitious men like Hans Luther are usually ambitious for their children as well. Recognizing Martin's intellectual gifts, the senior Luther planned a career in the law for his son, which he believed would guarantee him status and social respectability. Now, given the patriarchal culture of the time, Martin had no choice but to comply with his father's wishes. During an age when fathers were expected to rule their families and children were obligated to obey them without question, Hans Luther stood out as one who governed his household with a proverbial rod of iron. Later in life, Luther recalled how his father once whipped him so savagely that he ran away and hated his father until being won back by the power of his personality. Even his very devout mother beat him for the sake of stealing a nut on one occasion, until the blood flowed, he later complained. Maybe his beatings at the hands of his parents explains why Luther was so indulgent with his own children, leaving their disciplining in the hands of his formidable and very capable wife, Katharina. Still, I don't think Luther loved his parents any the less for their harsh treatment of him, commenting as an adult thus, "When God wants to speak with us, he does not avail himself of an angel, but of parents." Obeying his father, he entered law school at the University of Erfurt. But within a year, he had dropped out and, to his father's utter horror, had entered an Augustinian monastery. Now, what had prompted this sudden and very dramatic change of course? According to Luther, it had been prompted by a road to Damascus experience, in which he was almost killed by bolts of lightning during a violent thunderstorm, when, having been thrown from his horse, like St. Paul, he vowed to devote his life to God if his life was spared. Despite paternal disapproval, Martin thrived as an Augustinian friar. He was ordained a priest in 1507, celebrating his first Mass in the presence of his father and was deeply moved by the closeness of the awesome majesty of God. While plagued by feelings of unworthiness, Luther's rise through the ranks of the Augustinian order was meteoric, receiving his doctorate and being given the chair of biblical studies at Wittenberg University in 1512, a position he held for the rest of his life. Luther had visited Rome in 1510 on official Augustinian business. Much later, he claimed his experiences in the Eternal City had changed the course of his life. He claimed he had experienced a city that was worldly and corrupt, and a church hierarchy given to greed and licentiousness. His spiritual turmoil and feelings of unworthiness increased upon his return to Wittenberg, so much so that he sought guidance from the sympathetic Johann von Staupitz, Vicar General of the German Augustinians. Staupitz reminded Luther that true penitence begins not by fearing divine punishment, but by loving God and hating sin. It was sometime thereafter that the famous Turmerlebnis, or tower experience, occurred, when Luther, while sitting in a tower at his monastery and meditating upon St. Paul's epistle to the Romans, came to the sudden realization that righteousness is given freely by God to the faithful. Romans chapter 1, verses 16 through 17 in particular became for him a gate to heaven, so he later claimed. As Paul wrote, "For I am not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power of God unto salvation to everyone that believeth, to the Jew first, and also to the Greek. For therein is the righteousness of God revealed from faith to faith. As it is written, the just shall live by faith." Herein lies the basis for Luther's subsequent attacks on key teachings of the Church, most especially the belief that good works help one achieve salvation. Luther was a changed man. He now knew that faith alone made him righteous in the eyes of God. No longer would he feel compelled to spend 6 hours in the confessional confessing his sins, as happened on one occasion. Thus, when a Dominican seller of indulgences called John Tetzel showed up in a town near Wittenberg, it was with a spirit of confidence that Luther, no longer plagued by feelings of unworthiness, set out to confront him. Luther was alerted to Tetzel by some of his parishioners and students who told him that the Dominican had absolved them for the price of an indulgence from having to seek absolution through the sacrament of confession. Luther was livid, and he had every reason to be. The Catholic teaching on indulgences affords a sinner remission before God of temporal punishment due to sins for which absolution has already been received and whose guilt has been forgiven. Irrespective of the theological specifications, it was Luther's reaction to Tetzel that triggered the indulgence controversy that we now know provided the catalyst for what became the Protestant Reformation. Although Wittenberg was in the political jurisdiction of Prince Frederick of Saxony, it was in the ecclesiastical jurisdiction of Archbishop Albert of Magdeburg, who was, in addition, Archbishop of Mainz and the administrator of the See of Halberstadt, making him guilty of clerical pluralism. To remain a pluralist, Albert borrowed money from the Fuggers, one of the richest banking families in all of Europe, in order to buy a papal dispensation from Pope Leo X, himself in need of money for the building of St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. Now, if this is beginning to sound complicated, well, what can I say? It was complicated. Get used to it, ladies and gentlemen. Sometimes history is complicated and there's nothing we can do about it. Now, having said that, Pope Leo then authorized Albert to sell indulgences to raise money in order to repay what he had borrowed from the Fuggers. hence Tetzel's presence in a town near Luther's Wittenberg. And what a presence it was. And what an extraordinary man Tetzel must have been, able to attract thousands to his highly theatrical extravaganzas. Charismatic showman that had become a legend among those who sold indulgences, he possessed keen insight into human psychology and was able to play with a possibly guilt-ridden man or woman's emotional baggage, to use the language of the 21st century. While it sounds ludicrous to modern ears, one of his favourite slogans, "As soon as coin in coffer rings, the soul from purgatory springs," brought him phenomenal success. However, in a complete departure from church teaching, he claimed that one could pay for absolution in advance for sins not yet committed, but most likely would commit at some time in the future. As I said earlier, Luther became incensed when he learned of Tetzel's presence in the vicinity of Wittenberg. Although forbidden by Prince Frederick of Saxony from selling indulgences in Wittenberg itself, Tetzel had attracted Wittenbergers in their hundreds to the nearby town of Jutenburg in the neighbouring state of Thuringia, and it was through them that Luther first learned of the Dominicans' theological predations. What Luther did next provided the spark that ignited the fire that became the Protestant Reformation. As we shall see, ladies and gentlemen, that fire was soon to become a conflagration. Thank you very much.